The order wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. It moved like static between uniforms and sharpened boots. No one reacts. Not today. Buckingham Palace stood wrapped in mourning silence, the kind that feels too calm before something unexplainable. The guard captain's words were clipped, but heavy. If one of you even flinches, the whole world will see it, and they'll never forget it. There were whispers about potential disruptions, trending hashtags, anonymous threats. But out here, discipline was armor. Eyes forward, chin up. Stillness as survival. Corporal James Harwood had never failed at stillness. At 38, he was legend among the ranks. He didn't speak unless spoken to. Didn't twitch when a drunken tourist barked in his face. Didn't flinch when a child tossed ice beneath his feet. 12 years, not a single break in form. Journalists once called him the last wall of Britain, but even walls sometimes feel tremors before anyone else does. This morning, James felt one. It wasn't in the sky or the stones. It was in the quiet shift of the crowd just beyond the velvet rope. A subtle parting, a held breath. The cameras were ready, as always, shoulders hunched, lenses cocked, tourists muttering. But she wasn't like them. She moved through the crowd not with noise, but with intention. A woman in her mid-30s, wearing a fitted navy blue coat that caught the light like polished fabric. No phone, no giggles, no matching T-shirts with friends. Her stride wasn't arrogant, it was graceful, anchored by something older than confidence. When she stopped at the rope, the tourists instinctively cleared space. She didn't speak. She didn't gesture. She simply stood and looked at him. James didn't blink, but something behind his stern eyes registered her. Not her face, not yet. Not even her posture. It was the weight she carried in her silence, like someone who had nothing to prove and everything to remember. From a distance, it looked harmless. A quiet woman, a silent guard, but every heartbeat began to throb louder in James's ears. His body remained still, trained, locked in tradition. Yet deep inside, the muscle memory of something unfamiliar stirred. She raised her hand, slowly, deliberately, not high, not fast, just enough. And James, ever the sentinel, ever the statue, felt something shift beneath his breastplate. She wasn't holding a camera. She wasn't pointing at the palace. She was holding something else entirely. Something personal, something small, something that would unravel everything. And that was when the world stopped watching Buckingham Palace and started watching him. They didn't call him Iron Will because he looked tough. They called him that because no one had ever seen him break, not once. Not during a 16-hour royal procession in pouring rain. Not when a protester screamed inches from his face through a megaphone. Not even during the Queen Mother's funeral, when grown men trembled from the weight of grief. James Harwood had turned stillness into an art form. But that kind of stillness doesn't come from training alone. It comes from somewhere deeper, somewhere forged long before the uniform. His real training had begun at 9. That's when his parents died. Car accident, Christmas Eve, black ice and unfinished gifts still in the back seat. James never saw the wreckage, only the 2 police officers who stood at the orphanage gates. That night, his grandfather came for him, a wiry old man who'd served in North Africa and still polished his medals every Sunday. He didn't cry. He didn't hug. He simply said, "From now on, you keep your back straight. Stillness is strength, lad. You hear me? The world breaks noisy men. It remembers the quiet ones." James heard, and he obeyed. By 13, he was enrolled in cadet school. At 15, he could field strip a rifle blindfolded and recite entire pages of Churchill's memoirs by memory. While other boys snuck out to chase girls or sneak beers, James practiced standing, motionless, breath-controlled, perfect. He didn't laugh often. He didn't argue. He didn't let the world see what hurt. At 22, he wore his first scarlet tunic, stood outside St. Paul's Cathedral with a face carved from discipline. At 25, he was selected for a royal security detail during a summit in Vienna. At 30, the press gave him his nickname, Iron Will, after a protester launched into a furious rant just inches from his ear, megaphone howling, and James didn't even blink. A single image went viral. Red uniform, stone posture, eyes locked straight ahead while chaos raged around him. They printed posters of it. Tourists asked for him by name, but none of them knew what lay just beneath the armor. Tucked inside his breastplate, between metal ribbons and centuries of ritual, was a folded envelope. Soft with time, worn at the edges, unopened, untouched, sealed for 6 years. He'd carried it through every ceremony, every changing of the guard, every night shift beneath golden gates. He never read it, because he knew who it was from, and he wasn't ready. The letter had been given to him without explanation, on a bench in Hyde Park. Rain falling, a goodbye that hadn't sounded like one. She had simply looked at him with those calm, clear eyes and said, "You'll know when to open it." Then she walked away, and the next week she was gone. Not dead, not moved, just gone. He told himself it didn't matter, that silence was safer than answers, that maybe she hadn't meant much after all. But now, as that woman in the navy coat stood at the front of the crowd, calm and certain, James felt that sealed envelope pressing harder against his chest, like it had been waiting for her, like it recognized something he couldn't admit. He had survived war-zone threats, political riots, even grief itself, without moving. But this morning, beneath medals and titles and years of motionless loyalty, something began to stir. She didn't break the rope line. She slipped through it like it was never there. No shouts, no chaos. Just the sound of her heels tapping lightly against ancient stone, each step deliberate, measured and somehow inevitable. The crowd didn't react at first. Too stunned, too unsure. It wasn't how these things happened. Tourists crossed ropes for selfies, for dares, for drunken foolishness. But this woman, she didn't run, she didn't laugh. She didn't even raise a camera. She simply walked, with the kind of calm that rewrites the rules around it. Security hesitated. One officer's hand hovered near his radio. Another took half a step, then stopped. No one moved, because she wasn't a threat. Not in posture, not in presence. And that made her more unnerving than any protester ever could. James Harwood didn't blink. 12 years of unbroken ceremony, 6 monarchs, dozens of state events, storms, sirens, spitting tourists, none of it had ever shaken his stance. His pulse remained steady, his breath remained silent. He'd mastered the art of being seen without ever truly existing. But then she stood before him, just inches away. Navy coat buttoned to her collarbone, chestnut hair pulled back in a braid that trailed down her shoulder. No makeup, no jewelry, just clarity, radiating from her presence like heat from marble. And then she spoke. "So, this is what you became." The words weren't loud. They weren't accusatory, but they cut deeper than any scream. James didn't move, but inside something cracked, because he knew that voice, that calm, that steadiness edged with quiet fire, and he knew the name it came from, the name he had tried to forget for 6 years. Eleanor. He hadn't heard it in that long. Not since the day she disappeared into bureaucracy and military forms in a silence no one could explain. The official report called it a reassignment. His commanding officer called it confidential. Her sister called it a mistake. But James called it a ghost. Eleanor had been the only person who ever reached him. Not the uniform, not the medals. Her. The way she laughed without trying. The way she saw through silence like it was just smoke. She had been a lieutenant in the intelligence corps. Disciplined, unshakable, but never cold. They were supposed to be married. Then one morning, she was gone. And now, 6 years later, she stood in front of him. Real, alive, unannounced. She didn't touch him. She didn't cry. She simply tilted her head and said it again, more softly this time. "This is what you became." He wanted to look at her, to nod, to breathe. But the code bound him. The uniform held him still. But the seal on the letter beneath his uniform, creased and worn with time, burned hotter than it ever had before. Eleanor glanced down at the ribbon on his chest, then back at his eyes. "You haven't changed," she said. But her voice betrayed something else. Not anger, not loss, sadness, and maybe hope. The crowd behind her had fallen utterly silent. Phones still hovered in the air, hands half raised. But no one dared interrupt, because even without knowing who she was, they felt it. The weight of the moment. The wrongness of calling it a scene. This wasn't scandal. It was recognition. And James, he felt the weight of every minute he'd spent not asking what happened, every letter he didn't write, every question he buried beneath posture and protocol. Still, he didn't move. But inside, a war was beginning between what the guard expected and what his soul remembered. The memory had never left him. It hadn't disappeared the way others did. It had only drifted lower, buried beneath duty, repetition, and perfectly pressed uniforms. But now, with Eleanor standing in front of him, flesh and breath and alive, that memory surged back like a silent explosion, as vivid and immediate as if 6 years hadn't passed. He hadn't thought of the convoy in months, not really, but he could still recall the burnt orange dust of that forgotten village, the static in the radios, the wind that carried distant thunder when there were no clouds. Back then, James had been assigned to protect diplomats in a region hanging by a thread. Eleanor had arrived quietly, introduced as a humanitarian liaison. She wore no medals, carried no rank, and still somehow commanded the room, not through force, but through stillness. Not unlike him. Their connection wasn't dramatic. It wasn't rushed or romanticized. It just existed, between candlelight and silence, in the slow hours when the heat refused to fade and the danger outside the walls waited patiently. There was one night he remembered most. The generators had failed. The candles flickered weakly against the pitted concrete. She was stitching the cuff of her shirt with a needle and frayed thread, seated on the dusty floor. He had just come off patrol, exhausted but unable to rest. He didn't speak. Neither did she. Not until she whispered, "I don't do promises." Not in places like this. He'd nodded slowly, answering, "Me neither." But his hand still reached for hers across the empty space, and hers, for a single heartbeat, met him halfway. That was it. No grand confession, no plans. Just one silent gesture between two people trying to survive a place that did not allow softness. The next morning, she was gone. Reassigned, they said. Then word came, a convoy hit outside the southern perimeter. No survivors, no recovery, just charred steel and silence. They gave him her pack 3 days later. He didn't open it right away. He waited until lights out, when the room was still and the heat pressed down like guilt. Inside was a single sealed envelope, his name on the front. No return mark, no message, just the unmistakable shape of her handwriting. He stared at it for hours that night, turning it over again and again, but he couldn't bring himself to break the seal. Not then. He feared what it might undo, so he tucked it under his breastplate, and it stayed there. Through all the years of service, through every silent hour on the palace steps, through summer heat and winter storms, the letter never left its place, just above his heart. He became known for his stillness, his steel nerves. Iron-willed, they called him, after he stood motionless during a protester's scream inches from his ear. But inside he carried a tremor, not one you could see, but one that pulsed every time the wind changed. Now that tremor was rising. Eleanor was here, breathing, watching, real. And suddenly, the envelope beneath his chest didn't feel like armor. It felt like weight. It felt like truth. A truth he had buried in silence. She didn't ask if he had read it. She didn't need to. Her eyes already held the answer. And deep inside him, a voice he hadn't heard in years finally whispered, "It's time." It began with the smallest shift, one that almost no one noticed. The wind had quieted. The crowd had gone still. And there, in the breathless space between expectation and defiance, she raised her hand, not in anger, not in protest, but with the gentleness of someone carrying a fragile memory. Between her fingers, she held a photograph, creased at the corners, faded slightly from time. A snapshot of a moment once believed lost forever. Two people, younger then, faces softened by distance, framed in the amber dusk of a world neither had spoken of since, the kind of photo that wasn't posed, but captured in a breath of silence when the world had paused. She didn't wave it. She didn't beg him to look. She simply held it there, inches from his face, as if it were the final word in a sentence neither of them had dared finish. James felt it before he saw it, something cracking inside. Not loudly, not all at once, just the sound of a seal breaking deep within a part of him he'd trained never to open. His fingers, rigid for hours, twitched ever so slightly. His chest, bound in ceremonial posture, rose with a breath that felt like it had taken years to reach the surface. And then, against the doctrine of his entire life, he moved. One step, measured, heavy. His right boot landed with a sound that cut through the square like a dropped stone in water. Small, sharp, unstoppable. His rifle tilted slightly, still held but no longer perfect. Another step. The world felt suspended. Even the guards beside him remained frozen, unsure whether what was happening was real or just too unthinkable to process. But the crowd saw it. Phones lifted. Cameras zoomed. A ripple of gasps moved like a wave through the watching sea of tourists. Headlines unknowingly began writing themselves. His hand reached forward, not to block, not to reprimand, but to take. And when his fingers touched the photo, it was as if the last wall collapsed inside him. He didn't look around. He didn't check for permission. He simply stared at the image, at her, at himself, at a past he had shelved so tightly it had almost stopped existing. And then he spoke, quietly, just enough for her to hear. "I never read the letter," he said. His voice, unused for hours, came out lower than he remembered. Not a confession, not an apology, just a fact, one that had haunted him with every breath for 6 long years. Eleanor didn't speak immediately. She didn't nod or smile or move. She only opened her coat slowly and removed a weathered envelope from its lining. The same one. The same paper. Sealed. Unopened. She held it out to him, not dramatically, but with the calm gravity of someone delivering an answer long delayed. He looked at it. Really looked. And then, with both hands, he accepted it. He didn't move from formation to rat it. He didn't turn away. He broke no further protocol, but standing right there, in full view of every lens, every whisper, every law he had ever sworn to embody, Corporal James Harwood broke something more powerful than rules. He broke silence. He unfolded the letter slowly, hands steady, despite the weight behind them. The creases gave way like they'd been waiting, too. And as he read, line after line of words written in a world that thought she had died, his lips parted in a silent exhale. No tears, no theatrics, just the quiet collapse of walls no longer needed. Eleanor watched him with eyes that held no demand, only understanding. She had known this moment would cost him something. She'd come anyway. And now, watching him move, she saw not the breach of a soldier's posture, but the return of a man who had buried too much for too long. The crowd didn't cheer. It didn't need to. Some lowered their phones. Some just watched, unsure why their throats were tight. But deep down, they understood. This wasn't scandal. It wasn't drama. It was something sacred. A reunion that defied uniform. A truth that refused to stay sealed. And in that stillness, after everything, he finally stood, not for protocol, not for optics, but for her, for himself, for the moment that asked him to be more than a statue. The room wasn't grand. No golden crests or velvet chairs, just 3 men seated at a narrow table inside a gray-walled chamber deep within the palace's oldest wing, the kind of room that swallowed sound and made memory feel heavier. James stood alone before them, still in full uniform, though now the posture came not from duty, but choice. The silence was not imposed. It was waiting. Across from him, the officers didn't raise their voices. They didn't need to. One cleared his throat and began, eyes unreadable beneath thick brows. "You broke your vow of silence," he said, each word placed with precision. "You moved. You were touched. You were seen." The accusation wasn't cruel. It was clinical. Just a statement of fact. No drama, no noise. James didn't argue. He didn't plead. Instead, he slowly reached into the inner fold of his coat and withdrew a piece of parchment. The letter. Not the photo. Not a statement. Just a sentence from a past that had waited too long to be read aloud. He opened it gently, as if even the air might bruise it, and read, "If you're still standing still, I failed you." His voice didn't shake. It didn't echo, but it filled the room like something sacred. The words hung there, heavier than any rulebook. One of the commanders, older, with hands that trembled slightly as he interlaced them, let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Another shifted in his chair, not in anger, but in quiet reckoning. The third remained still for a long while, staring not at James, but at the letter. His gaze softened, just a shade. "You didn't just move," he said finally. "You reminded us why we stand." There was no gavel, no declaration, no punishment. The decision came the way most power does, quietly. A whispered exchange. A nod too subtle for cameras. A conclusion too human for protocol. Reassignment. Not disgrace, not honor, just preservation. James accepted it without expression. Not because he didn't feel it, but because he didn't need to perform it. He hadn't moved for applause. He hadn't moved for validation. He had moved because something finally mattered more than standing still. One officer rose. "You will not serve public ceremonies again," he said, folding his hands behind his back. "But you are not dismissed. Some legacies are too loud. Yours will remain in silence." A faint nod from the others. That was all. James saluted, turned, and walked out. Not with shame, not with pride. Just with purpose. Behind him, the door closed softly, and with it, one chapter of a man's obedience to stillness finally came to rest, not as a failure, but as the beginning of something more enduring than ceremony. The world kept spinning, of course. Tourists still lined up outside the palace gates, phones ready, hoping to catch a blink, a stumble, a reaction. But inside, beyond the velvet ropes, beyond the stone arches and gilded halls, James Harwood moved through quiet. The corridors of the inner royal gallery were sacred spaces, untouched by noise or headlines. Here, there were no crowds, no cameras, just oil paintings no one posted on Instagram, artifacts that had never gone viral, silence thick enough to feel holy. His boots now echoed softly on marble instead of courtyard stone, no more crimson tunic, no more medals gleaming in sunlight. His uniform was a deep navy now, formally plain, built for movement without ceremony. Fewer eyes watched him, but none of them mattered anymore. Because here, every object he passed held memory, not spectacle. A letter from a wartime monarch, a cracked metal box from the Blitz, a child's wooden toy carved by a king in exile. History didn't shout here, it hummed. James moved with reverence, not just for what surrounded him, but for what now lived inside him. The letter was still there, folded neatly, tucked beneath the lining of his new uniform. He didn't need to read it again. Every word lived in his bones now. It was no longer just Eleanor's voice on that paper. It was his own, reclaimed. Months passed without much change. He spoke little, kept to his duties, greeted the archivists with a respectful nod, never made noise unless it mattered. But those who worked near him began to notice something unspoken, a different kind of presence, not colder but deeper, a quiet resolve. Some called it humility, others called it peace. Then one evening, during a private benefit hosted for war veterans and royal scholars, she returned. Eleanor stood in the far end of the east wing beneath a glass case containing a faded field diary. She wore a navy dress this time, elegant but simple, hair tucked back, eyes scanning not for attention, but for memory. James saw her before she turned, but he waited. Let the air speak first. When their eyes met, nothing was said for a moment. Just that still, familiar warmth that once lived in silence and had now learned to breathe again. They spoke between artifacts, quietly, as if their voices might disturb the ghosts in the room. "I never wanted you to break rules," she said, her hand brushing the edge of a nearby display. "I wanted you to remember who you were before them." He looked at her, really looked this time, not through the mask of a uniform, but through the lens of every moment he had missed. "I wasn't sure that man still existed," he said. She gave him the kind of smile that feels more like a question. "He does," she whispered. "He just needed permission to move again." His hand rested on his chest, over the letter. "I thought duty meant stillness," he said, "but I stood for everything except what mattered. That day, I finally moved." They didn't embrace. They didn't need to. The space between them wasn't empty. It was full of things never spoken but always understood. The story spread, of course, not in tabloids, not through official statements, but in whispers, among new recruits, among officers who had once barked orders, but now paused before repeating the same phrases. They called him Iron Will, still, but the nickname meant something else now. It wasn't about never blinking. It was about knowing when to. Recruits asked quiet questions. "Did you really take a step forward? Was it true she touched your face? Did the letter really say you failed if you stayed still?" James never confirmed, never denied. He'd nod once, or say, "Some rules are meant to protect, but not all rules protect the right things." And that was enough. He became a quiet legend, not the kind cast in bronze, but the kind etched into memory, a reminder that standing still may honor the past, but stepping forward might just preserve the future. Late at night, when the halls grew colder and the lights dimmed, James sometimes walked the long gallery alone. He would pause before a painting or uniform case and think not about duty, but about choice, not about loyalty, but love. And on one particular evening, as the soft footsteps of a new recruit echoed faintly behind him, the young man paused beside James and asked the one question that mattered most. Was it worth it? James didn't answer right away. He looked ahead, at a display of a handwritten royal oath from generations past. He took a slow breath. Then finally, he said, "The moment I moved, I finally stood for something." And with that, the quiet settled again. Not as silence, but as understanding. Was he wrong to move? Or had he finally remembered what it truly meant to stand? Some say protocol is sacred. Others say humanity is older. But what would you have done if the past stood inches from your face and asked not for noise, but for truth? If this story stirred something in you, let it echo. Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe stillness isn't always strength, follow this journey for more. Because sometimes the most powerful moments aren't the ones we witness, but the ones that move us long after they're over.